He's one of our own at this point. We have Professor Sandy Levinson and Professor Logan Burney of Yale Law School. So this evening, we'll be generally debating the topic of presidential power in the 21st century and whether that is as the founders envisioned. And I guess that you can probably guess what each of our speakers would think about that, but they'll each give a nice long, probably 15 to 20 minute talk between the two of them, and then we'll have some question and answer at the end. So we'll go ahead and get started, but before we do, I'm going to introduce both of them with their nice long fancy law school resume, or their like law university resumes and everything like that. So first, we have the honor of welcoming Professor Logan Burney, who is an ISP faculty fellow at the Information Society Project and research scholar in law at Yale Law School. He's also the CEO of Matterhorn Transactions, a legal information services company that provides transaction term language and market trend analytics to firms and financial institutions across the US. He has invested in, helped to build multiple other successful software companies. Now, if you're wondering, where's the hook for executive power? In 2013, Professor Burney published the best-selling book, Blood of Tyrants, George Washington and the Forging of the American Presidency, which was selected for the Colby Award and the Lincoln Medal. He has also contributed to casebooks in corporate law. His writings have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, National Review, and other media outlets. And as we just learned in the prelude to this call, the last time that Professor Burney went out to an in-person restaurant was when he visited with our chapter last year at this time. So it's been quite a while, but not so long for us, and we're glad to have you back, Professor. Now on to one of our own. Professor Sandy Levinson is the Garwood Centennial Chair in Law at UT Law School, where he has taught since 1980. Previously a member of the Department of Politics at Princeton, he is also a professor in the Department of Government at the University of Texas. Levinson is the author of approximately 400, I read that right, 400 articles, book reviews, or commentaries in professional and popular journals, and a regular contributor to the popular blog Balkanization. He has also written 6 books, edited or co-edited numerous others, including one of the nation's leading constitutional law casebooks. He's a member of the American Law Institute. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2001. Professor Levinson holds a JD from Stanford Law and a PhD from Harvard. So we have a very distinguished group of professors with us tonight, and we're glad for their time. And now I'm going to cede the floor to Professor Burney.
Thank you, Seth. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate coming back. You're right. It was this time last year I gave a talk, and I believe it was during my talk, they announced that the president of the universities, he caught COVID, or his wife did, and they were shutting down the whole school. So the gates were closing as I was leaving the discussion. And it's really, we had no idea where we were heading. But Professor Levinson, thank you again for joining for a conversation. I always enjoy speaking with you. It's great to be doing this again this year with this tradition. I really enjoy it. And everyone out there, my goodness, what a year to be in law school. So please, whether you're FedSoc or not, see me as a resource. I want to be helpful. I want to, if I could help with career advice, with career connections, you name it. I'm here to help because I see how difficult it is out there. So thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to a great conversation. So when I talk about executive power, I start by talking about George Washington, which sounds insane. So if we're speaking about NSA surveillance or drone strikes, why am I talking about George Washington, who didn't have any of these things or even close to it? It sounds insane, right? Well, I think it's important to focus on our history for 2 reasons. The first is I think it's enlightened of us to learn from our history. What did we do right? And what did we do wrong? So we don't repeat those mistakes. When I was writing the book that Seth mentioned, I read a quote from George Washington that really stuck with me. He said, "The foundation of our empire was laid not in a gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but an epoch when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined. In that auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation, and if its citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be entirely their own." So I hear that, and I hear a direct charge to each and every one of us to be engaged in our society, to be learning from our history, to be learning from the news, and really take the health of the presidency in our country more broadly into our own hands, and having discussions exactly like this, attending these sorts of debates and discussions. And I think that it's a really important first step to understand our history. And I think Professor Levinson and I very much agree on that, that our history is really important and that we should be learning from it. So if that sounds a little too, starry-eyed for you, and maybe you don't think that's enough to focus on the history, well, I think there's a second reason that history is important, and that is, like it or not, it impacts modern law. There's a lot of debate about originalism, whether how much weight we should give it, whether we should give it any weight, and which parts we should be looking at. But sort of the fact of the matter is, majority of justices, judges, they all look to this founding history as at least a starting point for constitutional interpretation. We could certainly debate how much and where and what, but as Justice Kagan said, we are all originalists now. So it's important whether you like this history and it supports your argument, or you think this history is the worst and you want to argue against it, you should know it. It'll inform your arguments and make you into great lawyers. Okay, so George Washington. When I was learning about history, I guess more in high school, it seemed like these founding fathers were treated as these sort of demigods that sort of divined all these answers, and they're so wise. Well, that wasn't the case. They were human beings, often quite flawed human beings. In some ways, that makes it very impressive with what an interesting constitution and long-lasting and worthwhile constitution, I think, that they created. So one of the biggest debates from the start has been over Article 1, the powers of the presidency. Article 2, I'm tripping up. I have an 8-month-old who's yelling in the background and sort of messing me up. But anyway, so the powers of the presidency. And when the debate has been, particularly around the commander-in-chief clause. So the powers of the presidency are not really laid out. And they're looking at, for example, over and over again throughout history, the president will say, I have these powers due to my commander-in-chief powers. So it only says the president should be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy and doesn't elaborate a whole much more than that. So I argue that it's important to look to the very first commander-in-chief when they were writing the thing. So when they were writing the Constitution, we only had one American commander-in-chief. That was George Washington. There had been the British monarch was considered a commander-in-chief back then, and others like John Yoo argue that you should look to the monarch's powers. I don't think that's a good path to look at the monarch, because if you look at the Declaration of Independence and you see the founding generation was not happy with how the monarch was using his powers. It's sort of the Declaration of Independence is a bit of a laundry list of what was wrong with it. So in the beginning, we knew a lot about what we didn't like about executive power, specifically the commander-in-chief power, that later became part of the broader executive. And we didn't know what was the right way. What was the American way? We didn't really know. And a lot of it was made up as they went along. So in April of 1775, war breaks out. The Americans start rising up in Lexington and Concord against the British due to many things like taxes, illegal search and seizures, quartering of soldiers in their homes. And it becomes too much, and they start rising up against the British. The American colonies at the time, they realized that they need to have a leader. So they need to have some sort of American commander-in-chief to lead these forces in this rebellion. But they being good Americans, they learned from their history. And history had showed them over and over again that when you give a military man too much power, what does he do? He tends to keep it, right? So we were worried about repeating that cycle. But practical matters required that they have a leader in charge of their forces. So when they were deciding who would be this sort of experimental American commander-in-chief, they chose George Washington, which is kind of an odd choice. He had a lot less military experience than others. For example, Charles Lee was a major contender. He had fought across Europe for the British Army. He had a lot of experience, brilliant tactician. He was also the sort of guy that He had a pack of dogs that was always around him. He was caught in a brothel at one point. So it's not sort of the moral character they want to build a new American commander-in-chief a concept around. So instead, they chose George Washington, who had fought for the Virginia militia. He had arguably helped spark the French and Indian War due to a blunder in which he attacked a French diplomatic party. He had some sort of very brave but somewhat lackluster military experience. But what he did have was what they called the martial dignity. He was someone who seemed very principled and was willing to uphold liberty. And sure enough, lesson number one from George Washington, he shows up at the Continental Congress when they're deciding this thing, and he's wearing his full military uniform that he had not been serving for decades at that point, but he shows up. So lesson one, dress the part. So he, and sure enough, when there's military matters came up, they asked him. He ended up being elected as the first commander-in-chief to lead the forces at this point up in Boston. And he was sent. By June 1775, he had about 20,000 American militiamen under his command. These are farmers, merchants, you name it, guys with guns. And they had besieged within Boston about 8,000 British redcoats. So you think about it, 8,000 British redcoats, 20,000 American militiamen, you have the numbers on your side, right? So Washington made the decision that he should bombard the city and take over and take out this British army while he has the numbers on his side. But he doesn't. Instead, he goes back to Congress and he says to he goes to John Adams at this point, who was the president of the Continental Congress, and he says, "May I lay siege to Boston?" And Adams says, "Absolutely not. You may not do. That's going to cause lots of damage to one of our most important cities. Even though militarily it may make perfect sense, politically speaking, you may not." And Washington listens. What is he doing? He's establishing civilian control over the military. Again, this is pretty radical historically for a commander-in-chief of any sort to not have the power to make this sort of decision. Sure enough, the British escape up into Canada, and then the Americans know the next point of attack is going to be New York City. So New York is the best port around, and the British have the most powerful navy around the entire world. So if they want to subdue the colonies, and they want to use their navy to do so, they want to take control of New York City. Washington knows this. Everyone knows this. So Washington marches down to New York City and starts trying to fortify. But he is wise enough to realize if you're fighting the most powerful navy on earth and you have virtually no navy of your own, perhaps you shouldn't try to defend an island, right? And so he petitions to have the fight make a stand inland. Again, he writes back to the Continental Congress and says, "I think we should make our stand inland." And again, Adams writes back and says, he sees no irony in saying, "I have no military experience of my own, but it is politically imperative that you make a stand in New York City." And again, Washington says, "So be it." And sure enough, we are trounced at the Battle of Long Island. We almost lose the war. We only end up escaping when a nor'easter, a nasty weather pattern we get in the Northeast, swoops in and sort of provides cover for Washington to escape. Washington he escapes across the East River into Manhattan, where he knows that the British are going to invade any day. So again, goes back to Congress and says, "That went terribly. We can't fight their forces and their ships at the same time. We need to retreat." And Congress says, "No, no, no." And then Congress does what Congress does best. They start a committee. And that committee is sent to Staten Island to have the Staten Island Peace Conference. At the Staten Island Peace Conference in the summer of 1776, they go to, they ask, okay, under what terms can we end these hostilities? And sure enough, the British are not, they're pretty optimistic about their impending victory. They say, "Sure, you could have peace, but all of your leaders will be hanged." And so the Congress in Washington hear this, and that's not acceptable. So they finally say to Washington, "Okay, you can retreat." but it's too late because the British are already invading across the East River. And Washington's force, a third of Washington's army is trapped in southern Manhattan. And there's only thanks to, fun little trivia here, Mistress Murray in Murray Hill, the section of Manhattan called Murray Hill. She brought 4 British officers into her house and gave them lots and lots of Portuguese wine, and then, quote, caused them to tarry for 4 hours. We don't know what she did, but God bless her, that gave the distraction they needed to escape. So the British are chasing Washington and his army through New Jersey. And at this point, we're into the fall of 1776. And Washington is chased all the way to the Delaware River. So think about the geography here. So say, you're all the Continental Congress and you're in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Before, the war was sort of far away. It was in Boston, which was far away. And now it's in, it was, at least in New York City, it was in New Jersey away. Now it's right at your doorstep. And they just said that they want to hang all the leaders. So this is when they change their tune. This is December 1776, in which they grant Washington with what they called dictatorial powers. I know how that sounds to our ears. We hear dictator, we think of it sort of dirty word. To them, they would think of the Roman Republic, in which when the Roman Republic was under grave threat, the Senate would be dissolved, and all the power, the military power, political power, you name it, would go to one man. And then that one man would use it, hopefully, to repel the threat, and then hopefully give it back. It didn't always work out that way. But Washington proved over and over again that he was a principled patriot and looking to fight for liberty, that he would use it wisely. But we had a major problem. We're not ancient Rome. We, for us, it was, we the people is the sovereign, not sort of the Roman Senate or Congress certainly was not the sovereign. It was we the people. Now, granted, we the people was white men who could vote, and white women were, they were sort of disenfranchised citizens who their main role was seen as, to raise virtuous sons and children, which, the absurdity of a lot of that was actually, even at the time, noted of, sort of who we the people were. But we the people is a much more dispersed group for us versus the Roman Senate, for example. But if you strip we the people of their rights, then what happens? You're being just like the king. You're being just as bad as he is. So what they do is they split out the powers. The political power remains with we the people. And practically speaking, what that meant was the courts kept operating, the citizens kept their rights. Washington was one of the only major revolutionary figures never to declare martial law, and having the citizens keep their rights. This is pretty radical, that they kept their rights. And we could, do a quick example of how that worked out. But then what did Washington get? Well, Washington became a military dictator, which sounds bad to our ears, but to them, that meant that when it came to military matters, when it came to foreign affairs, dealing with foreign nationals, dealing with prisoners of war, and foreign intelligence matters, he had a lot more say for the rest of the war. No longer was it the sort of, may I lay siege to Boston sort of questioning of what are his powers. Instead, it was sort of, attack the enemy first, maybe, tell Congress later sort of approach when it came to dealing with the war and the foreign nationals and the soldiers. Okay, so just a quick example of how that played out. And then I'd love to hear Professor Levinson, and also as we get into the more Q&A, we can start really connecting all of this history to modern issues, because I think it does, history may not repeat, but it rhymes. And I think there's a lot of connections and rich discussions we could have about how, how this history is the same or how it's different from what many of the things we're facing now. So just a quick example being, everyone knows about Benedict Arnold, the great traitor, right? People don't focus on his co-conspirators. One was American citizen named Joshua Hett Smith. He was a loyalist. So loyalists made up about 20% of the population. So think about that. 40% were patriots, so not even a majority. 40% were sort of on the fence or didn't want to be involved. And then the remaining 20%, so a big portion of the population, they were against the cause. That's a huge portion. So in many ways, the Revolutionary War was also a civil war, and so that makes it even more surprising that Washington was willing to give the citizens, even the ones that didn't want to be citizens, like the loyalists, their rights. Very radical precedent to set that is that important in the fight for liberty, that you give citizens their rights, and it's not the commander in chief. And my argument is that that notion of commander in chief became the seed in which we built the presidency around later on. That the citizens, the American citizens, still retain their rights. I mean, it's really important. Okay, and then the other co-conspirator was a man named John Andre, British intelligence officer. He was, he's an interesting character. He left England because his fiance dumped him. He was sort of more into poetry than warfare. Everyone sort of loved the guy. Sure enough, he was doing his job. He was helping Benedict Arnold sell out West Point. So West Point is an upstate from New York City. The British wanted control over the Hudson River, so they could use their ships after their victory in beating us in New York City to cordon off the New England rebellious colonies and win the war. So Washington built a fortification to keep the British from controlling the Hudson at West Point, and it ended up being named Fort Arnold because Benedict Arnold asked for control of it. Washington respected the young man. He's one of our best officers before he betrayed us. So he gives Arnold control. Arnold uses that control to work with Andre and later Smith to make a sort of dance where it looked like he was going to put up a defense of West Point, but actually give it away very quickly. And then he could escape and do it again with another installation. And if you lose West Point, you probably lose the war. Second important installation, then we've definitely lost the war. And the British were going to pay him equivalent about $25 million to do so. So he's going to make a lot of money doing it. So anyway, so he works with Smith and Andre to send the plans back to the British command in New York City. And so on the way back, luckily for us, they are captured. So they capture Smith and Andre. And Washington goes to Smith, this is the American, and he says, "I have enough evidence to hang you on yonder tree." And he wanted to. Washington was scared. He was angry. He felt he was betrayed. He couldn't believe this was happening. He didn't know how far-reaching this conspiracy was. Who could he trust? And he wanted vengeance. But instead, he gives him a 2-week-long trial and due process. So as much as these loyalists as they were, Franklin referred to them as disgusting toads. It was more important to Washington to respect the rights of the citizens and set that precedent than want to just sort of have the instant justice he wanted. And sure enough, Smith got off. He argued for himself. He represented himself. You're going to be great lawyers. Don't do that. But he did. And his argument was that there's a high burden of proof for American citizens. And I was just following the orders of an American officer, which Arnold was. And he got off, sure enough. And then they turned to Andre. This was the much more likable character who was a British intelligence officer. And his argument was, yes, I was relaying intelligence. That's my job. You can take me captive and you could trade me for another high-ranking officer that we have of yours, but don't kill me. Too bad Washington has him hanged in 2 days. Washington is setting another precedent. When it came to foreign nationals, he had a lot more say. He provided him with a military commission, no due process, and he had a lot more ability to, now that he was this empowered commander, when it came to these sort of specific spheres. So sort of the sphere of foreign affairs, foreign nationals, over his own troops, he had a lot more authority, versus when you start bringing that power home and focusing on the citizens themselves, that has sort of the presidency as lowest ebb. But I'd love to start connecting this to modern times. But first, I'd love to hear Professor Levinson's thoughts.
Thanks. I thought that was very interesting, but frankly, I'm not sure what it has to do with understanding the president's powers under the U.S. Constitution. We could, I think, very profitably spend the next half hour talking about various very important lessons from what we have heard, one of the lessons I remain convinced is that the British made a series of absolutely disastrous decisions that what we call the American Revolution, that I tend to call the secession from the British Empire, was totally unnecessary. It was provoked by a variety of disastrous policy decisions, very few of them having to do with King George. The so-called patriots were angry at King George primarily because he refused to veto legislation passed by Parliament. They had not gotten the memo that, in fact, the British monarch had fundamentally lost the power to veto legislation. The last veto, I think, was 1708 with Queen Anne. And in the 1770s, it was almost literally unthinkable that King George would veto acts of parliament that were very dumb politically vis-a-vis the colonies. That's why they were primarily angry at George. They were angry at the rest of the British for what in retrospect seem like insane decisions to shut down the Boston Harbor, and to establish extraordinarily onerous embargoes. And I think there's a lot to be learned about from that in terms of contemporary foreign policy that doesn't make sense to believe that you will win struggles against dedicated opponents by adopting certain very harsh policies. If this were a different evening, we could talk about the British policy in New England and American policies toward Cuba now for some 60 years. But that's not really the topic of the evening. The topic of the evening is what can we learn from George Washington? And I actually think that there is a lot to learn from George Washington as a person. I tend to share Mr. Burns' admiration for Washington as a person, slaveholder though he was. He did have an unusually dignified character. He was truly honorable in many important ways. George Washington, not King George, is said to have said that when Washington voluntarily laid down his power, and he did it twice. First of all, after the success of the secession or revolution. Secondly, not running for re-election for a third term, King George is said to have said, this makes him the greatest man in history, because the assumption is those with power want to hang on to power. I'm very, very fond of quoting a political scientist from the 1960s named John P. Roach, who modified the dictum that I'm sure all of you have heard from Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Roach's dictum, which I quote every opportunity I think it's appropriate, is that power may corrupt, but it's the prospect of losing power that corrupts absolutely. And the remarkable example that George Washington presented the country was not his losing power, but his giving up power. And that is truly extraordinary. It was extraordinary then and extraordinary now that one can look around the world. The United States, most recently, Israel this very week, where political leaders are simply unwilling to recognize either they've been beaten fair and square in elections, as happened with Donald Trump, or as in Israel right now, that the country is very, very much in need of new leadership, but Netanyahu insists on staying on come hell or high water. And Washington is really an admirable example of a person who always put his country ahead of his personal ambition. I'm a big fan of Hamilton, of the play Hamilton, and I find it very moving every time I hear the farewell address, which is part of the musical. And it's introduced by saying, when Hamilton says, "Oh no, you've got to run for re-election to beat my hated enemy, and therefore I presume your hated enemy, Thomas Jefferson." Um, in the play, Jefferson says, "No, I must teach Americans how to say goodbye." That is to retire from the scene and recognize that it's up to them to pick new leaders. That is an extraordinarily wonderful gift that George Washington gave the country. I happened to be in China in 1987 for a bicentennial seminar in Beijing, the 200th anniversary of the US Constitution, and there were a number of Chinese scholars who actually study the US Constitution. My wife, on a given day, went down to Tiananmen Square and saw the embalmed body of Chairman Mao. That evening, during conversation, we got into a conversation with some Chinese students about a topic that I had rarely thought about up until 1987. That is the 22nd Amendment, which prohibits presidents from running for more than 2 terms. One of the Chinese students said, "This is a wonderful feature of the US Constitution because it is a direct attack on the cult of the indispensable leader." The other Chinese student said, "No, it's an awful feature because what it says is that the people cannot maintain an office somebody they believe is doing a really great job." Washington established the custom, the convention of the 2-term rule. And it stuck, of course, until FDR ran for a 3rd term in 1940. And there were some very good reasons why he ran for a 3rd term in 1940. World War II was clearly imminent, and there were very good reasons to think that Roosevelt had certain skills that would make him very good as a war leader, which turned out, in fact, to be the case. But he was accused of breaking this constitutional convention. And in 1947, depending on how you read the history, the Republican Congress retaliated against FDR, or the American people came to the solemn decision that, Washington created a very good precedent, and we should not run the risk of ambitious political leaders who want to hold on to power, come what may. So you simply say you got 2 terms and that's it. That, as I say, I think is an extraordinarily important lesson, but frankly, it has almost nothing to do with contemporary debates about originalism or anti-originalism. I'm a big fan of a recent book by Sai Prakash, very much integrated into the Federalist Society. The title of the book is "The Living Presidency, an Originalist Argument Against Its Ever-Expanding Powers." He takes both of the main sides in contemporary constitutional debate to task. He is harshly critical of Federalist Society members like John Yoo and most of the current Supreme Court, who believe indeed in an ever-expanding presidency. So you get Hawaii, the Hawaii decision. You get a whole bunch of decisions saying that the president has extraordinarily expanded powers. And Prakash says, if you're a genuine originalist, you should recognize this is wrong. And he goes through the arguments, and we certainly don't have the time right now to go through the arguments. On the other side, he attacks people like me. I am not an originalist. I have very little patience for originalism as a constitutional method. So I suppose that makes me a living originalist. And what Prakash says quite cogently is that our arguments, that is, the arguments of the living originalists, ultimately have more to do with politics than with an argument founded in the 1787 Constitution. And, I think that's probably right, because I don't think that the 1787 Constitution can tell us very much about what we want presidents in 2021 to be able to do. It is a banal truth. In Washington's farewell address, he counseled us against, quote, entangling alliances. He was an isolationist, but he was an isolationist, a term, frankly, that makes almost no sense in 1787, because there really wasn't anybody who wasn't an isolationist in contemporary terms, because we were protected by the pond, the Atlantic Ocean. We needed a strong national defense in order to protect us against foreign countries that might attack us. And there were a whole bunch of countries that didn't wish us well. But the idea of having alliances with these foreign countries was not on the table. In fact, Washington's most important act as an activist president was his neutrality declaration, where he basically tore up against the pleading of Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, an alliance we had with France. And quite frankly, we never, ever would have become an independent country were it not for the French. It was not Washington's skill as a general. Logan is admirably candid in recognizing that Washington's generalship skills were debatable. What was great about him was his character, and also the fact, ironically or not, that Benedict Arnold won the Battle of Saratoga for the Americans. That got the French and the Dutch to decide to help finance this effort by the ragtag American army to secede from the British Empire, because that obviously was congruent with the foreign policy aims of France and Holland. And we ended up with Yorktown, where the French Navy was the principal contributor to the victory at Yorktown. But then, partly, of course, because the French Revolution took place in 1789, Washington made the altogether cogent argument that the France that was our friend in 1783 was not the France that had executed the king and was becoming a radically different country. Jefferson obviously disagreed, but the important thing is that Washington declared neutrality, and then in his farewell address said we should basically take advantage of the fact that we are protected by the Atlantic Ocean. Let Europe be Europe. So long as they don't attack us, we will have really nothing to do with them. Whereas in the modern world, for better and for worse, every American president, with the possible exception of Donald Trump, who had no coherent foreign policy, but going from Teddy Roosevelt to George W. Bush to Ronald Reagan to Bill Clinton to Barack Obama and now Joe Biden, all of them agree that we have to pay huge attention to the fact that we have alliances all over the world. We have American military bases. I'm making up the number because I don't know what the number is on any given day, but I think we have about 151 military bases in over 100 countries around the world. There are still American military bases in Korea, Germany, and Japan 70 years after the end of World War II and the Korean War. That's the world a modern president lives in. And so, quite frankly, For better and for worse, I'm not sure that there's anything to learn from the presidency of George Washington, or for that matter, what the framers thought the presidency would be in a country where the weapon of mass destruction was a cannon, not airplanes, not nuclear weapons, not poison gases, etc. But I am sure there is a lot to be learned from George Washington as a man of character. And I am not alone in wishing that modern presidents were more Washingtonian than most of them have been. Historians can debate with one another when the decline began. Many would say Andrew Jackson, the first demagogue president, the first populist president. Others, interestingly enough, might say Abraham Lincoln, who in a variety of ways pushed presidential power for all it's worth. Others, we'd have different candidates. But I do think that almost everyone recognizes that we're simply living in a different political and military geopolitical world than Washington and the framers. And so looking to them for specific advice, I think is a fool's errand. But looking to them for very heightened conceptions of what kind of person we want to inhabit the office of the presidency and what kind of character is displayed by the person who inhabits that office, then it is very much worthwhile to read biographies of Washington and to ask what can be learned from his really quite remarkable character.
Excellent.
So, Professor Berney, I think we'll give you a couple of minutes to respond before we move on to the question and answer session.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I always enjoy speaking with you. We don't agree on originalism, and I think that's totally fair. I always learn from what you say. But I think you should be an originalist. I think I'm going to keep trying. I know I'll never get there, but I really think you should be an originalist because this history has everything to do with what's happening now. And the reason is partially exactly what you were saying, where for Prakash, for instance, and sort of even the story I told as far as curtailing the powers of the presidency when it comes to domestic matters, this, originalism at its heart is something that does keep, is designed to keep the imperial presidency at bay. I do believe in a powerful presidency, and I think the history shows a powerful presidency when it comes to foreign nationals and foreign affairs, as I described in my examples of Washington. But as originalism, used, I think the in a sort of thoughtful way actually really would help, I think augment a lot of your arguments. And I think in some ways you would like it. I'll keep trying to convince you to become an originalist, even though I'm not sure I ever will. But even not sort of, this is where I get back to the beginning of what I was saying, where I think you and I are in very much agreement in sort of the lessons we learned, and it's enlightened to learn from them. I think I just go a step further than you do. And I think this is actually very practical. And I think this is sort of my, very practical side saying, look at the Supreme Court decisions, look at, Hamdan, Hamdi, sort of, just a few that come to mind. They're looking to exactly the history I'm talking about when they're deciding these cases. So, we may not like it, but I think it's good to know this history so you can contend with it. Or, it can be used in really important ways, I think, to keep, to keep the presidency in check. And I think if you, just one more thought, if you sort of strip away the technology and sort of it becomes more about the rights of citizens and nationals and sort of basic presidential power, and looking at Article 2, Section 2 in particular, the Commander-in-Chief Clause, when you take away the technology, it's not about how you're killing someone, whether it's, you mentioned gas or guns versus cannons or jets, but whom. But so if you start applying drone strikes, there's another example in which people are using drone strikes overseas. The technology seems so far removed. If you take away the technology, what you're actually talking about are basic principles of who does the president have the power to execute. So when President Obama used that power without any kind of trial or due process to kill an American citizen, Al-Awlaki, I spoke up. I wrote a lot about that, saying Al-Awlaki seemed like a total terrorist, and not a good person by any means, but he was an American citizen, and the precedent President Obama had set by summarily executing him without any kind of due process at home or otherwise, I think that's really problematic. And that's just another example of when you strip away the technology and look at sort of the rights of government versus the citizens, all this history has everything to do with what's happening now, I think.
Professor, any last words before we move to question and answer? Professor Levinson?
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree substantially with the Al-Awlaki example, but we could spend the rest of our time together tossing back and forth examples of both Democratic and Republican presidents who, from, I think, Prakash's perspective, overreached. Harry Truman's unilateral decision to go into Korea, Richard Nixon's decisions to bomb Cambodia and Laos and to lie about it, Ronald Reagan's decision to invade Grenada, George H.W. Bush's decision to invade Panama, Bill Clinton's decision to go to war in the South Balkans. The Felix Frankfurter once wrote about the gloss of history. And the gloss of history, for better and maybe both of us would agree for worse, is ever expanding presidential power. So that the original, this is the whole point of Prakash's book. He is, if not quite in splendid isolation, he is in a minority of people who call themselves originalists in saying that presidents have too much power, not simply in terms of the Al-Awlaki example. And I think that's right. So one very last point, if somehow or other we were to adopt originalism as the one true theory, then I really do think we would have to revise legal education, because quite frankly, there is not a single member of the US Supreme Court today who is a competent historian. And we don't train our students, whether it's at the Yale Law School or the University of Texas Law School, to be competent historians. So one of my qualms about originalism is that people pretend to take history seriously, but aren't willing to do the hard work that professional historians do. And that, I have other objections to originalism, but at a practical level, that really is one of the deepest. Antonin Scalia is simply not a reliable historian of the Second Amendment, even though I believe that Heller was in fact rightly decided.
Well, thank you for that, Professor Levinson. I'm actually going to start us off with a question on a similar vein. Just that last thing that you said struck this up in my mind. You said if we adopt originalism as a interpretive method of choice in the federal courts, there are plenty of at least self-described originalists on the court. Do you think that there needs to be any change to the law school education to emphasize originalists, to make us all more effective advocates?
It's yes and no. If originalism really and truly were a serious theory of the Constitution, then yes, we would have to change the way we teach. Just as with regard to law and economics, which I'm also not a devotee of law and economics, but it is very clear that you can't graduate from a leading law school today without developing a nodding acquaintance with quite a bit of economics. And in certain areas of law, like antitrust, it's really a good idea if you want to teach it to have a PhD in economics. And simply talking about an indifference curve or price demand ratios is not enough to make you a competent economist. Most of our discussion about history is amateur hour. And, I object to that as an academic.
Professor Berney, any thoughts on that as well?
Yes. So I think originalism is a very serious method that's being used all the time and having real impact on our lives. So I think it's long been one. I think I agree with a lot of what Professor Levinson's saying as far as the lack of training in that vein and looking at the history. And that's sort of, but I guess my different approach is, I advocate for more of it. I want to create competent historians as we're going through law schools. That's exactly why we're having this discussion. I want to get people more involved. I want people to be looking into this history. I myself, started this work as a student in law school, and it started as a student paper, what became the book. And I sort of, got into some, serious scholarship that arose out of classroom discussions like we're having right now. So I guess my approach, I agree with Professor Levinson in a lot of ways. But I guess my approach is just different in that I think that it is here. It is it can used in many great ways if you're, especially if you're looking into curtail the presidency when it comes to domestic policy. And we're talking about Prakash law, but my book is sort of half that. It's sort of half looking and curtailing the powers of the presidency. The other half sort of, there is something to be said for a strong executive when it comes to foreign affairs. But either way, my approach is I want to get people interested in this. I want to advocate for schools to be training us in this history more. I want there to be more classes in this, because then as the next generation of leaders, I want you to know this and be interested in this and studying this and actually coming up with, sound historical arguments that are in keeping with what the history really says.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to move us back over to questions about the actual substance of y'all's talk tonight. So sorry for the brief aside there. So we have a question from one of our 1Ls, Sophia Shams. She says, what are your thoughts? I'm going to pose this question to both of you. What are your thoughts regarding the AUMF and how it has been used by presidents to justify beyond the legislation's originally limited authorization?
I'm happy to jump in. So, declarations of war are few and far between. Even the text of the Constitution, says the Congress has the power to declare war. They don't do it. But authorizations of use of force happened very early too. With, Jefferson, the Barbary Pirates, for instance. So, I think in general, I think there sort of has, even since the founding, an understanding that Congress can authorize in different ways, whether it's a full declaration or another other authorization. I do think that authorization is quite important. I think that the way that they in Madison described the commander-in-chief was as a dog on a leash. And if you think about it that way, where if you come into the dog's yard, the dog can bite you because he's on his leash. However, if you're going to send him to someone else's yard, you need Congress to act in some way to take them off the leash. And that sort of defensive, very defensive methods where the president has more power to defend quickly without authorization. But anything that becomes offensive and further away physically when it comes to distance, that's when the founding generation would suggest you definitely need authorization. I think sort of where we are now, sort of the authorization force since post 9/11. I think it's getting really long in the tooth. I think it was authorized against the Taliban and Al Qaeda, and it's been used. And Professor Levinson was saying there's examples throughout. Yeah, I'm an equal opportunity critic of Republican, Democrats. All the presidents are doing it, and sort of with Bush using it for Iraq, President Obama using it for strikes in Syria, sort of on and on and on and on. I think that would be a good example of when history would suggest that the dog is no longer let off the leash to go into every yard just because 20 years ago it was focused on a very specific mission.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it is a scandal that we still operate under the AUMF, but the primary criticism should be directed at Congress that is spineless in terms of asserting powers they clearly have under the Constitution. So criticism of presidential overreach has a certain hollow ring to it, because if Congress really cared, they could do something about it. This is not something that requires constitutional amendment. It would simply require Congress standing up to exercise its own clear powers. And for all sorts of reasons, they're unwilling to do so. And all of them, Democrats and Republicans alike, should be censored for their acquiescence to this steady presidential aggrandizement.
All right, so next we have a question from Tanner Baird. He's at 2L in Bedside. Would you speak to changes in the requirements for the commander-in-chief to prosecute foreign soldiers today? Can international treaties restrict the power of the president to prosecute war criminals? And if not, how do the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials compare to the trial of Major Andre?
Mm-hmm. Professor Levinson, do you have thoughts first?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a huge literature about the legitimacy of the Nuremberg trials, and they were used basically as the foundation stone for a view of international law that a number of people said at the time just was false to the positive reality of international law. But ironically enough, and this actually fits with the anecdote about Smith, who got a trial, Churchill simply wanted to execute the Nazi leaders summarily. And the argument made by the United States was that it was very, very important to have trials and to prove to the world that they deserved this kind of punishment, because of course many of them were executed. Robert Jackson left the Supreme Court for a year to become the chief prosecutor, and these are among the arguments he made. Major Andre was accused not of violating international law, he was accused of violating the relatively well-established law of the time about the rights of combatants as against the rights of spies. And the fact is, you're much, much better off if you're a uniformed combatant. In 1783 or 1781 and in 2021, you're a prisoner of war. Spies are not prisoners of war. They're not uniformed, almost by definition. They couldn't be effective spies if they were. And so they're at risk. And some of them will be executed. Some of them will be imprisoned and then traded for spies held by the adversary. But, I do think that the United States can enter into valid international treaties that would affect our ability to prosecute people we considered to be miscreants, just as the international community could have the right to prosecute Americans. We don't like hearing that, but that is an implication of Nuremberg.
So yeah, Hamilton felt really bad for Andre and really tried to lobby a little bit for him, because the poor guy, he really didn't want, even at the end, he asked to be shot rather than hanged, so he had a little bit of honor, and Washington didn't even give him that. So I think historically speaking, there'd actually be, if you could sort of dig up Washington now, there'd be a lot of surprise at sort of how much the presidency has agreed to curtail the power and sort of cede it to international agreements. Back then they sort of have seen the idea that the American president can do these things unilaterally. It began sort of going back to what Professor Levinson was saying. It was, in that context, it was, a very, us versus them kind of world. There was no idea, no concept of globalization. There's no concepts of, cooperation. Even just look the way we, our allies, France, the first chance we got, we sort of double crossed them to have a better peace treaty, which is, again, kudos to us. We sort of outfoxed them, but just sort of there was the sort of level of cooperation that we have now would be unheard of then, and they would never sort of see it as okay to have any kind of international organization tell the president what his powers are. But that's the history.
So I realize we're a little bit over time. I'm going to ask one last question because I think it ties a nice little bow. It's not necessarily about Washington, the president, so much as the virtue of Washington, the man. That's from Warren Bloom. He says, if it's the height of virtue for a president to not run free election when the people would likely reelect him, why should he have ever run in the first place? It seems to me that if you have, like FDR did, Professor Levinson, what it takes to lead, you should.
I think that is a fundamental question that in a Republican form of government, one should recognize that nobody is indispensable. And the fact that the public might like to reelect you is not evidence for the proposition that you ought to stay there forever. This is the greatness of Washington in teaching people how to say goodbye and take responsibility for their own futures. But that's why I found this exchange between the two Chinese students in 1987 so genuinely illuminating. I have cited it probably 3 or 4 times in stuff that I've written, and I often bring it up in my courses, because they were making good arguments on both sides. If in fact, Chairman Mao did not run for elections, but if in fact there had been elections and Chairman Mao said, I've done a great job, I'm the national liberator, the way Washington was the national liberator, the head of the national liberation movement, I've gotten this ragtag government up and running, and give me another 10 years and I can do an even better job. Why shouldn't the Chinese people be able to say, yeah? So is the objection to Chairman Mao only that he didn't run for re-election, or that he really did think, like Vladimir Putin or Benjamin Netanyahu, for that matter, that he should stay on forever rather than recognize that the country needs new leadership? But it's a genuine argument that nobody who is truly modest runs for office. So if Washington didn't want to be president, he could have said what General Sherman said when a number of people after the Civil War wanted Sherman to run. And he said, if elected, I will not serve. And people believed him. That's not what Washington said.
Washington is, he really evolved as a person. So he was very ambitious when he was younger, even getting into the Revolutionary War, wearing the uniform to the Continental Congress to get the position. Very ambitious man. But then, sure enough, at the war changed him, and then afterwards he returns. He stepped down from commander in chief. Some people wanted him to be king, and he said no. Then he wanted to just retire to his farm, but then he saw the country falling apart. And then he was sort of brought back out of his retirement that he loved so much. And he needed to go the Constitutional Convention and risk his reputation on that. And then after that, he had to be the president. I think Washington had a very much America first approach to the presidency, to a lot of decisions he made. That came out in different ways. When it came to foreign policy, it was not sort of a dirty word, say, what's in it for us? How does this help American citizens? But I think as that continued, his America first approach also translated into his own actions. So what if America's first, even I, Washington, am second? So if it's best for the country that I don't become sort of a quasi monarch that rules until he dies, that's not good for America. So if, doing what's best for America means I step down, that's what he did.
All right. Well, I think as far as questions go, that's all the time we'll have for tonight. I deeply appreciate both of y'all's time, and I'm going to close with a couple of announcements, if y'all don't mind.
Sure.
First thing, Professor Levinson, you mentioned you're a Hamilton fan, so you'll be interested in this. Next Thursday, we're going to have an event by Judge Charles Eskridge from the Southern District of Texas, and it's entitled An Original Document for Every Hamilton Song. And it is exactly what it sounds like. So he will go through the musical and give us an original document for every song.
Uh-huh.
And then the evening after, we'll be hosting, COVID compliant, of course, different watch parties for the musical Hamilton, which is now on Disney Plus.
Right.
So if you're interested in that, be sure to look around for emails coming in on that. And Professor Levin said, I'll make sure you have the Zoom link for next Thursday night as well. Now, with that out of the way, the only other thing I wanted to mention is the registration for what we are calling FedSoc Floaties, which is basically just a float trip coming up in a couple of weeks, closes on Monday. So if you're interested in coming along for that, be sure to check your email. I sent that link back to you on Monday. This past Monday, registration closes this upcoming Monday. So social events, substantive events, everything's taken care of for next week. And with that, we'll close for the evening. Thank you so much.